The dust of redemption, Creek held its breath, waiting. For Abigail Hayes, it was the dust of a new life, the final step on a journey of 1,000 miles that was meant to end at the altar. But the man waiting there, Bowmont Sinclair, the town's golden son, shattered her world with a single public word: no. Humiliation burned hotter than the Arizona sun, as every eye in the crowd became a stone cast in judgment. Alone, shamed, and with nowhere to turn, she was a ghost before she had even begun to live. And then a shadow fell over her. From the edge of the crowd, an Apache warrior, a man who should have been her enemy, stepped into the void. His voice was low, cutting through the stunned silence, and his words were not a question, but a claim. You're mine, now. The air in Redemption Creek, Arizona was a thick, gritty thing in the summer of 1878. It smelled of hot sand, horse sweat, and the faint metallic tang of fear that always lingered at the edge of the frontier. For Abigail Hayes, however, it smelled of hope. Standing on the newly constructed church steps, her fingers nervously twisting the lace of her gloves, she saw not a dusty, unforgiving landscape, but the canvas for her future. She had traveled for 2 months from the relative civility of Ohio, a journey that had stripped away her naivete layer by layer, replacing it with a hardened pragmatism. She was a mail-order bride, a fact that some whispered about with derision, but for Abigail, whose family had been ruined by a misplaced investment, it was a lifeline. Her correspondence with Bowmont Bo Sinclair had been a whirlwind of poetic promises and grand pronouncements of a shared, prosperous future. His letters, penned in a confident, looping script, spoke of his sprawling ranch, his influence in the town, and his desire for a refined partner to share it with. He was, by all accounts, the town's most eligible bachelor, the handsome son of the man who had practically carved Redemption Creek out of the wilderness, the late Franklin Sinclair. Today was their wedding day. The entire town, it seemed, had gathered in the dusty plaza before the church. Miners with sun-cracked faces stood beside bonneted ladies, fanning themselves furiously against the oppressive heat. Ranch hands leaned against hitching posts, their spurs glinting in the sun. It was a spectacle, and Abigail was at its center. Her dress, a modest ivory silk she had sewn herself, felt impossibly fine in this rough-hewn world. She saw Bo waiting at the makeshift altar inside the half-finished church. He was as handsome as his photograph had promised, with hair the color of corn silk and a smile that seemed to own the very air around him. But as she drew closer, escorted by the town's gruff but kindly Sheriff Thompson, she saw a flicker of something in Bo's blue eyes. It wasn't the adoring gaze of a groom, but the panicked darting of a cornered animal. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach, cold and heavy. Reverend Michael, a man whose gentle face seemed perpetually etched with concern, began the service. His voice was a soothing balm, but it couldn't quell the rising tension. When the time came for the vows, Bo's voice, which had been so bold in his letters, was a mere whisper. When the Reverend turned to him and asked, "Do you, Bowmont Sinclair, take this woman Abigail Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The world seemed to stop. Bo cleared his throat. He looked not at Abigail but past her toward the expectant crowd. A strange, cruel smirk touched his lips. "No," he said. The word was quiet, yet it crashed through the church with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Reverend Michael's jaw went slack. Sheriff Thompson took a half-step forward, his hand instinctively going to the colt at his hip. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. It had to be a joke, a crude frontier jest that she simply didn't understand. She managed a weak, trembling smile. "Bow." He finally looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes was absolute. "I said no. I will not marry you." He turned to the crowd, his voice now booming with self-righteous indignation. "This woman is not who she claims to be. My family's good name will not be sullied by a deceiver from the East, a woman of questionable reputation and even more questionable means." The accusation was a fiction, a monstrous lie, spat from the mouth of the man who had promised her a kingdom. But in that moment, the truth didn't matter. The crowd, initially stunned, began to murmur. The whispers turned to pointed stares. She was an outsider, an unknown quantity. Bow was one of them. It was his word against hers, and her word was worth less than the dust on her shoes. Tears of shame and fury welled in her eyes, blurring the sea of hostile faces. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her journey had not ended at an altar of hope, but on a scaffold of public humiliation. She had no family here, no friends, no money to even begin the 1,000-mile journey back to a home that no longer existed. She was trapped. It was in that moment of absolute despair that the crowd parted. He had been standing at the back near the wide-open church doors, a silent observer cloaked in shadow. She had noticed him earlier, a stark, out-of-place figure. He wasn't a townsman. He was Apache. Tall and broad-shouldered with black hair that fell past his shoulders, held back by a simple leather band. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, his skin the color of burnished copper. He wore buckskin breeches and a warrior's simple tunic unadorned except for a single eagle feather tied in his hair. His eyes, dark and intense, had missed nothing. The townsfolk shrank away from him as he moved. There was an aura of lethal grace about him, a coiled stillness that promised swift and terrible violence. He walked not with a swagger, but with the quiet, deliberate tread of a predator. The murmuring of the crowd died, replaced by a fearful silence. Even Bow, in his moment of cruel triumph, seemed to shrink. The warrior stopped directly in front of the altar, his gaze sweeping over the scene, the sputtering reverend, the impotent sheriff, the preening coward Bow, and finally the shattered woman in the ivory dress. He looked at Abigail, and for a fleeting second his expression was unreadable. It was not pity, nor was it contempt. It was an assessment, a weighing. Then he turned his eyes to Beau St. Clair, and the look he gave him could have frozen the desert sun. He spoke, and his voice was low and guttural, yet it carried to every corner of the church. The English was heavily accented, but clear, each word a stone dropped into the silence. "You cast this woman away?" he asked, though it was not a question. It was a statement of fact, laced with a derision that made Beau's earlier pronouncements sound like the whining of a child. Beau puffed out his chest, a pathetic attempt to reclaim his authority. "This is a private matter, savage. It's no concern of—" The Apache warrior took one step forward, and Beau flinched back as if struck. The warrior's hand did not go to the knife, sheathed at his belt. But the threat was there in his eyes, in the very air around him. He looked back at Abigail, her tears now carving clean tracks through the dust that had settled on her cheeks. He saw not a deceiver, but a woman stripped bare in front of her enemies. He saw a flicker of fight in her eyes, a spark of defiance buried deep beneath the shame. He held her gaze, and then he made his declaration, a claim that would forever alter the course of her life and the fate of Redemption Creek itself. "She is not cast away," the warrior stated, his voice resonating with an unshakable finality. He pointed a finger not at her, but at his own chest. She is with me." He looked directly at her past the tears and the trembling and into the very core of her being. "You're mine now." The warrior's words hung in the suffocating air of the church, an impossible, world-altering statement. The silence that followed was profound, a vacuum of disbelief. Abigail stared at him, this wild, intimidating stranger, her mind struggling to process the claim. "Mine." It was a word of possession, of ownership. Yet in that moment, coming from this man, it felt less like a subjugation and more like a shield thrown up against the entire world that had just condemned her. Sheriff Thompson was the first to find his voice. "Now, hold on, Nachokai," he said, using the Apache's name. The name itself seemed to command a grudging respect. "You can't just, you know the law. You can't just lay claim to a white woman." Nachokai didn't turn to face the sheriff. His dark eyes remained fixed on Abigail. "Your law," he scoffed the word, dripping with contempt. "Your law allows a man to shame a woman before his God and his people to break a sworn promise. My law is one of honor. He has thrown her away. He has declared her worthless. I say she is not." Beau Sinclair, emboldened by the sheriff's intervention, finally found his footing. "He's right. Sheriff, arrest this savage. He's threatening a citizen." "He is not a citizen," Nachokai said, turning his head slowly to pin Beau with a look of pure loathing. "He is a coward, a Nantan with no spine." He then looked back to Abigail, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "You will come with me. There is no life for you here." It was true. She looked past him at the faces in the crowd. She saw no sympathy, only a lurid curiosity and simmering resentment. They had already judged her. To stay in Redemption Creek would be to live as a pariah, a living symbol of scandal dependent on the charity of those who despised her. She would be less than a ghost, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of Beau Sinclair's manufactured righteousness. But to go with this man, an Apache, the sworn enemies of the settlers. Tales of their brutality were whispered around every campfire and preached from every pulpit. To leave the flimsy protection of the town walls was to willingly walk into a world of unknown horrors. And yet, what choice did she have? The man who had saved her pennies for traveled 1,000 miles for and dreamed of a life with had just tried to destroy her in front of everyone. The man who was a stranger, a supposed savage, was the only one who had offered her a hand. It was not a gentle hand, but it was the only one extended. I have my things," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was a foolish, practical thought in a world turned upside down. Nachokai gave a curt nod. "Get them." This broke the spell. Sheriff Thompson stepped forward, placing a hand on Nachokai's arm. "I can't let you do this, son. For her own good." Nachokai's muscles tensed, and he looked down at the sheriff's hand as if it were a snake. "You will not stop me, Thompson," he said, his voice a low growl. "She is under my protection. Anyone who tries to stop us answers to me. And to my brothers, who wait beyond the creek." A fresh wave of fear rippled through the onlookers. The implication was clear. Nachokai was not alone. An attack on him would be an attack on his war party, and Redemption Creek was in no position to fight an Apache raid. The threat was enough. The sheriff slowly, reluctantly removed his hand. Abigail, moving as if in a dream, turned from the altar. She walked past Beau, who stared at her with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She didn't look at him. To look at him would be to acknowledge he still had power over her, and she refused to give him that satisfaction. She walked down the aisle, the townsfolk parting before her as if she carried a disease. Their whispers followed her like insects. Her meager belongings were in a small room at the back of the mercantile, kindly lent to her by the owner, a Mr. Abernathy, who now refused to meet her eye. With numb fingers, she packed her spare dress, her book of poetry, and the small silver-framed photograph of her parents. Every object was a relic from a life that no longer existed. Lastly, she gathered the bundle of letters from Bow tied with a blue ribbon. She held them for a moment, the paper promises that had proven to be as brittle as ash. With a surge of cold fury, she tossed them into the cold stove. When she returned to the church, Nachokai was waiting. He had not moved. He stood like a statue of rock and leather, a bulwark against the town's hostility. He took her small carpet bag from her, without a word, his touch surprisingly gentle. He turned and began to walk, and Abigail, after a moment's hesitation, followed him. They walked out of the church and into the blinding sunlight, the crowd parting for them. The silence was absolute. No one dared to challenge the Apache warrior. No one offered Abigail a word of comfort or farewell. She had been excised from Redemption Creek as cleanly as a surgeon might remove a cancer. Nachokai led her to a lean, muscular pinto pony tethered near the edge of the plaza. With an effortless motion, he swung himself into the saddle. He then looked down at her and extended his hand. It was a hand calloused by work and war, stained by the sun. It was the hand of a man from a world she could not possibly comprehend. Taking it was a leap into an abyss. She looked back one last time at the town of Redemption Creek. She saw Beau Sinclair standing on the church steps, his sister Isabel beside him, now her expression one of pure venomous triumph. She saw Sheriff Thompson watching her, his face a mask of weary resignation. She saw 100 other faces all close to her. Then she looked up at Nachokai, at his dark, unreadable eyes, and the offered hand. It was the only hand in the world that was open to her. She took it. His grip was firm and strong, and he easily pulled her up to sit in front of him on the pony. Her back was pressed against his chest, and she could feel the heat of him, the solid, unyielding strength. It was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. Without a backward glance, Nachokai nudged the pony into a trot, and they left Redemption Creek behind. The sound of the town, the whispers, the judgment all faded, replaced by the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves on the hard, packed earth. They were riding east toward the jagged, sun-blasted mountains that the settlers called the Devil's Spine. The Apache called them home. Abigail did not cry. The tears had frozen inside her. She rode with her back straight, her gaze fixed on the unforgiving horizon. A woman twice broken in a single day, the property of a man she didn't know, heading toward a fate she couldn't imagine. The journey into the mountains was a silent one. Nachokai spoke only when necessary, issuing curt commands or pointing out landmarks with a gesture of his chin. "Hold tight. Drink. We rest here." Abigail perched awkwardly in front of him, obeyed without question. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a gnawing, ever-present fear. Every rustle in the scrub brush, every shadow that danced among the saguaro cacti, sent a jolt of panic through her. She was a city woman, accustomed to cobblestones and gaslights. This world was alien and eluv, and she felt as fragile as a porcelain doll in a rock slide. The sun was a relentless hammer, and the heat that radiated from the sand seemed to suck the very moisture from her bones. Nachokai, however, seemed a part of the landscape. He moved with an economy of motion, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the terrain, with a familiarity that was absolute. He navigated through treacherous, trackless wastes as if following a paved road, his expression never changing from one of fierce, focused intensity. Late in the afternoon, he guided the pony into a small, hidden canyon where a trickle of water seeped from the rock face, nurturing a patch of hardy green grass. He slid from the horse, and then with his hands firmly on her waist, lifted her down. Her legs stiff from hours of riding nearly buckled, and she had to steady herself against the warm flank of the pony. "We wait for the moon," he said, already unslinging a water skin. He handed it to her. The water was warm but life-giving, and she drank deeply, not caring that it trickled down her chin and stained the front of her ruined dress. As she drank, 2 other riders emerged from the rocks, materializing so silently that she gasped. They were Apache dressed like Nachokai, their faces hard and watchful. They greeted Nachokai with low murmurs in their own tongue and sharp, curious glances at Abigail. She felt her fear spike again. These were his brothers. They were just as intimidating as he was. Nachokai spoke to them in the rapid, guttural flow of the Apache language. Though she couldn't understand the words, the tone was one of command. He gestured back in the direction of Redemption Creek, then at her. One of the warriors, a younger man with a vicious scar across his cheek, let out a short, harsh laugh and said something that made the other one smirk. Nachokai's head snapped toward him. He spat a single, sharp word. The laughter died instantly. The scarred warrior lowered his gaze, his expression sullen. The message was clear, even in a language she didn't know she was not to be mocked. She was his, and his claim extended to his men. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a strange, reluctant gratitude. He had not only saved her from the town, but he was also protecting her from his own people. As dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, one of the warriors handed her a piece of dried meat. It was tough and stringy, but she was starving and she ate it without complaint. She sat apart, wrapping her arms around her knees, a lonely island of ivory silk in a sea of buckskin and rock. She watched the 3 men, their conversation low and serious. She was the subject of it, she knew. She was a problem, a complication, a white woman brought into their world. When the moon rose a silver disk in an indigo sky, they rode again. The desert, so harsh and glaring by day, transformed into a place of ethereal monochrome beauty. Nachokai seemed to prefer traveling by night, and Abigail began to understand why. The air was cooler, and the shadows provided cover. They rode for 2 more days, their journey taking them higher and higher into the rugged heart of the mountains. The landscape changed from desert scrub to pinon pine and juniper. The air grew thin and crisp. On the morning of the 3rd day, they crested a ridge, and Nachokai finally reined in the pinto. Below them, nestled in a wide, well-hidden valley, was a small settlement. It was not a town of wooden buildings and dusty streets, but a scattering of wickiups, domed huts made of branches and hides. Smoke curled lazily from a dozen different fires. The sounds of children laughing and dogs barking drifted up on the wind. It was the Apache camp, Nachokai's home. As they descended the narrow trail into the valley, a wave of apprehension washed over Abigail. If she was an object of curiosity to Nachokai's 2 warriors, what would she be to an entire village? Her arrival caused an immediate stir. People stopped what they were doing and stared. Women emerged from their wickiups, their dark eyes wide with surprise and suspicion. Children who had been playing a frantic game with a leather ball fell silent and hid behind their mothers' skirts. The stares were intense, dissecting her from the dusty hem of her dress to the pale skin of her face. She was an alien, a creature from another world. The hostility was a palpable thing thicker than the wood smoke. Nachokai ignored them all. He rode to the center of the camp and dismounted, then lifted her down. He spoke to a group of older men who had gathered, his voice calm and authoritative. He was clearly a man of importance here, a leader. He was their Nantan. His speech was met with grave faces and murmurs of dissent. An old man, with a face like a dried apple, his chest covered in scars, spoke vehemently, jabbing a finger in Abigail's direction. Others nodded in agreement. She was not welcome here. The debate grew more heated. Abigail stood alone beside the Pinto, her bag clutched in her hand like a shield, feeling the weight of every accusing eye. She wished the ground would swallow her whole. Why had he brought her here? Had he saved her from humiliation in redemption? Creek, only to subject her to a slower, more agonizing death by 1,000 hostile stares in his own camp. Finally, an older woman stepped forward. She was tall and stately, her graying hair in 2 thick braids. Her face was lined with wisdom and sorrow, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She silenced the men with a sharp word and a raised hand. She walked directly to Abigail and looked her up and down, her gaze lingering on Abigail's face, her hands, her impractical shoes. Then she spoke to Nachokai, her tone questioning. He replied, his voice softer than Abigail had ever heard it. Their exchange was brief. The woman then turned back to Abigail. She reached out a weathered hand, and to Abigail's surprise gently touched her cheek. The touch was not unkind. The woman said a single word in Apache, then turned and walked back to her wickiup. Nachokai turned to Abigail. That was my mother, Tiana. She says you have the eyes of a frightened deer, but not a stupid one. She has given you her protection. He then gestured toward a small, unoccupied wickiup on the edge of the camp. This will be yours. No one will harm you. His words were a promise, an order to his entire village. Over the next few weeks, Abigail began a life she could never have imagined. It was a life of hardship and constant labor. She learned to grind corn with a stone, to gather edible roots under Tiana's patient tutelage, and to mend buckskin with an awl and sinew. The Apache women, following Tiana's lead, slowly began to tolerate her presence. The initial hostility softened into a wary acceptance. They gave her a simple buckskin dress more practical than her ruined silk, and taught her a few essential words in their language. She learned that Nachokai was a respected war chief, a man who had led many successful raids against the Mexican soldiers to the south, and more recently had fought to protect his people's territory from encroaching American prospectors. He was a widower. His wife and young son had been killed 2 years prior during a cavalry attack on their winter camp, an attack that had been guided by scouts from Redemption Creek. The knowledge hit Abigail with the force of a physical blow. The people of the town that had cast her out were responsible for the death of his family. His presence in the church that day had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate act of observation, of intelligence gathering, and his claim on her. What had it been? An act of mercy, an act of defiance, or an act of revenge against the white world, taking something one of its men had prized and then discarded. Her relationship with Nachokai remained distant and formal. He provided for her, ensuring she had food and protection, but he rarely spoke to her. He would watch her sometimes from across the camp, his expression unreadable. She was his property, yet he treated her with a strange, detached respect. He made no demands of her, never entered her wickiup, never touched her beyond a steadying hand. She was in a state of limbo, a prisoner without chains. She was no longer Abigail Hayes of Ohio, the hopeful bride. But she was not yet one of the Apache. She was something in between, a ghost haunting two worlds belonging to neither. And as the days turned into weeks, a new, more complicated feeling began to grow in the ashes of her old life, a deep, unsettling curiosity about the silent, formidable warrior who had claimed her as his own. While Abigail was learning to navigate the rugged landscape of the Apache world, the ripples of her departure were spreading through Redemption Creek, turning from a scandal into a festering wound. Bowmont Sinclair had expected Abigail's humiliation to be his triumph. He had envisioned himself as the town's righteous protector, the man who had sniffed out a duplicitous Easterner and saved the community's honor. But the story didn't play out that way. The dramatic intervention of Nachakai had shifted the narrative. Bo hadn't just rejected a bride. He had lost her to an Apache. In the masculine, honor-bound society of the West, this was an unbearable shame. Men at the saloon didn't clap him on the back. They watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He had been challenged by a savage in his own church, and he had done nothing. He had let the warrior walk away with the woman he was supposed to marry. The story was told and retold, each telling embellishing Nachokai's stoicism and Bo's flustered inaction. His sister Isabel was relentless. "You let him take her," she would hiss at him in the privacy of their large, empty ranch house. "You let that filthy animal lay hands on your intended and just stood there. You have made the Sinclair name a laughingstock." What was I to do, Izzy? He had a war party waiting. Bo would protest, his voice thin and reedy. "A real man would have died before suffering such an indignity," she would retort, her eyes flashing with a fury that was far more potent than his own. The truth of Bo's rejection was far more craven than the fiction he'd created. Abigail's dowry, which he had counted on, was modest. More importantly, just a week before her arrival, Bo had discovered a rich vein of silver on a remote section of his property. He was suddenly potentially one of the wealthiest men in the territory. He no longer needed a mail-order bride with a small nest egg. He could now aim for the daughter of a cattle baron or a San Francisco banker. Abigail Hayes had become an inconvenience, an embarrassing loose end to be snipped. His public denouncement was meant to be a quick, clean break, absolving him of any guilt. But now his newfound wealth felt hollow. The whispers followed him everywhere. He became obsessed with the woman he had cast aside. The fact that she was alive, living somewhere in the mountains with him, was a constant burning humiliation. He began to paint a new picture of the event in his mind, one where Abigail hadn't gone willingly, but had been abducted, a terrified white woman, held captive by a brutal savage. He was not a coward. He was a man whose bride had been stolen. This version of the story began to take root in the town. It was easier for people to believe. It restored the natural order of things, the vulnerable white woman, the savage Indian, and the wronged man. Fear of the Apache was a potent force, and Bo stoked it expertly. "He took her by force," he'd say gravely to the men at the mercantile. "She's a prisoner up there. We have to do something. It's a matter of Christian duty." Sheriff Thompson, a man who valued peace above all else, was skeptical. "Bo, I was there. She walked out with him. Took her bag and all. Didn't look like much of a kidnapping to me." She was terrified, Sheriff. What choice did she have with that knife-wielding animal threatening everyone? Bow insisted, his voice rising with theatrical passion. The sentiment began to shift. The men who had pitied him now saw a cause. Rescuing a white woman from the clutches of the Apache was the stuff of dime novels, a heroic quest. It was a chance to assert their dominance, to wash away the stain of Nachokai's audacious challenge. Bow's obsession deepened when a letter arrived from his late mother's solicitor in Philadelphia. It turned out that a distant wealthy aunt had passed away, leaving a significant inheritance not to Bow or his father, but directly to Bow's future wife as a wedding gift. The inheritance was contingent on his marriage and was 10 times the value of Abigail's original dowry. The letter had been chasing Abigail across the country and had arrived weeks after her. The money, a small fortune, legally belonged to the woman he had publicly shamed and driven into the arms of his enemy. The humiliation, the greed, and the wounded pride coalesced into a single burning purpose: he had to get her back. He didn't want Abigail. He wanted what she represented: his honor, his standing, and now his fortune. He began to gather a posse. He used his new silver to buy the loyalty of desperate men-drifters and out-of-work miners who were more than willing to risk a fight for good pay. He promised them bonuses for the rescue. He bought new rifles, ammunition, and supplies. His quest was no longer just talk. It was becoming a small private army. Sheriff Thompson watched the preparations with a growing sense of dread. "You're going to start a war, Bow," he warned him one evening, as Bow's men practiced shooting at bottles behind the saloon. "I'm going to rescue my fiancée," Bow corrected him, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. "It's time we reminded those savages who this land belongs to. It's time we brought Abigail Hayes home." The final piece of his plan fell into place when one of his hired men, a tracker named Courtman, with a reputation for ruthlessness, captured a young Apache hunter who had strayed too far from the mountains. Under threat of a rope, the young man revealed the location of Nachokai's Valley camp. Now Bow had a destination. He had the men and the guns. He had a cause, however twisted. As he looked at the map, Courtman drew in the dirt. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. He would ride into that valley, kill Nachokai, and drag Abigail back to Redemption Creek, whether she wanted to come or not. He would be the hero of his own story at last. The final act was about to begin. Life in the Apache camp was a rhythm, and Abigail slowly learned its tempo. The days were governed by the sun, the seasons, and the needs of the community. The initial fear had been replaced by a grudging respect for the people she now lived among. She saw not the savages of frontier stories, but a proud, resilient people fighting for their existence. She saw the tenderness of a mother soothing a child, the laughter of friends sharing a meal, and the deep, quiet sorrow for those they had lost. Tiana Nachokai's mother became her guide. The older woman taught her without many words, using gestures and demonstrations. Abigail learned which plants healed and which poisoned. She learned the intricate patterns of beadwork, her fingers once accustomed to piano keys, growing nimble with an awl and sinew. She learned to listen to the language and slowly, haltingly began to speak it. She learned to be useful. Her relationship with Nachokai remained a silent, charged space between them. He was often gone for days at a time, leading hunting parties or scouting patrols. When he was in the camp, his presence was a powerful magnetic force. Abigail found herself watching him, drawn to the quiet authority in his posture and the deep well of sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. One evening, as she sat outside her wickiup mending a water skin, he approached her. It was the first time he had sought her out for conversation that wasn't purely functional. He sat on a rock nearby, watching her work. "Your hands have learned a new skill," he said, his voice a low rumble. Abigail didn't look up, a strange shyness taking hold of her. "Tiana is a patient teacher." "She is. She does not waste her patience on those who cannot learn." A rare compliment. "She says you have a strong spirit, that it was not broken." Abigail paused her work, her needle still. "It was badly bent." He nodded, understanding. "A strong branch bends in the wind. A brittle one snaps." He looked out at the darkening valley. "You think of your old life, sometimes," she admitted quietly. "I think of the woman who arrived in Redemption Creek. She was a fool." "She was hopeful," he corrected gently. "It is not foolish to hope. It is foolish to place that hope in a man with no honor." He looked at her, then his gaze direct and intense. "Do you wish to go back?" The question hung in the air between them. Go back to what? To Bow. To a world that had spat her out. The thought was absurd. "That world has nothing for me," she said, her voice firm. "My life is here now." She wasn't sure if it was a statement of fact or a prayer. "Here life is hard," he warned. "There is no silk, no soft beds. There is only the sky and the earth and the fight to live between them." "I am not afraid of hardship," she replied, finally meeting his eyes. "I am more afraid of betrayal." A silent understanding passed between them. In that moment, the chasm that separated their two worlds seemed to shrink. She was not just a white woman he had claimed. He was not just the Apache warrior who had saved her. They were two people marked by loss and betrayal, finding a strange solace in each other's presence. The moment was broken by the sound of a horse being ridden hard into camp. It was one of Nachakai's scouts. His face grim, his pony lathered in sweat. He spoke in urgent, worried Apache, gesturing back toward the lowlands. Nachakai listened, his body going rigid, his face becoming a mask of stone. The easy calm of a moment before vanished, replaced by the lethal focus of the war chief. He issued a series of rapid-fire commands. Men grabbed rifles and bows, their faces grim. Women began to hurriedly gather children and supplies, their movements practiced and efficient. The peaceful camp transformed into a hornet's nest, preparing for an attack. Tiana rushed to Abigail's side. "White men," she said the English word, stark and ugly. "Many of them. They come this way." Abigail's blood ran cold. Bow. It had to be. Nachakai came to her, a rifle in one hand, a cartridge belt slung over his shoulder. "You must go with my mother and the others," he commanded. "There is a safe place, a cave system deep in the mountains. You will be safe there." "And you?" she asked, her heart pounding. "I will stay," he said, his jaw set. "This is my home. I will defend it." She looked at him, at the warrior preparing to fight men from her world for a home that had become her sanctuary. The thought of hiding in a cave while he fought was unbearable. "No," she said, the word surprising even herself with its force. "I am not leaving." He stared at her, his dark eyes narrowed. "This is not your fight, Abigail." It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded strange and wonderful on his lips. "The man leading them, Bowmont Sinclair, he is the reason I am here," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "He is the man who shamed me. This is my fight as much as it is yours. I will not hide." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, searching her face. He saw no fear, only a fierce, unwavering determination that mirrored his own. He saw the woman Tiana had spoken of, the one with the strong spirit that would not break. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Ha-i," he said. "Yes." "Then stand with me." He pressed a small, sheathed knife into her hand. "Stay behind the rocks. Do not show yourself unless you must." As the Apache warriors took their positions among the rocks at the narrow entrance to the valley, Abigail huddled with Tiana behind a large boulder. She could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs. Below in the twilight, she could see them, a column of riders, at least 20 of them, with Beau Sinclair and a hard-faced tracker at their head. They were picking their way up the trail, confident, arrogant intruders in this sacred space. This was it. The world she had left was coming to reclaim her, to finish the destruction it had started. But she was not the same woman who had stood on the church steps. She was no longer alone, and she would not be broken again. Beau Sinclair rode at the head of his posse with a feeling of supreme confidence. The air was thin and cool, a welcome change from the oppressive heat of the flats. Courtman, the tracker, had been true to his word. The trail was clear. Below him, nestled in the valley, he could see the faint glow of the Apache campfires. He imagined Abigail there, a captive, praying for a hero. Today he would be that hero. "We storm the camp at first light," he announced to the men behind him. "Show no quarter. We find the girl and we get 'em out." Courtman spat a stream of tobacco juice. "No quarter it is, Mr. Sinclair, but this feels too easy. Nachokai's no fool. This trail is a perfect ambush point." "Nonsense," Beau scoffed. "They're sleeping. We have surprise on our side." But as they rounded a sharp bend in the trail, a voice echoed from the rocks above, speaking in perfect, unaccented English. "That's far enough, Bowmont." Beau and his men reined in their horses, startled. They scanned the rocks, but saw nothing but shadows. The voice was female. It was Abigail. "Abigail!" Beau called out, his voice a mixture of confusion and anger. "Abigail, is that you?" "Don't worry, my dear. I've come to save you." A dry, mirthless laugh was his answer. "Save me from what?" "From a man of honor. From a people who gave me shelter when my own kind cast me out." She stepped out from behind the boulder, then a silhouette against the last light of the dying sun. She was not the woman they remembered. The fine dress was gone, replaced by simple buckskin. Her hair was not coiffed, but tied back in a practical braid. In her hand, she held the knife Nachokai had given her. She did not look like a captive. She looked formidable. Beau stared dumbfounded. This was not part of his plan. "Abigail, what has he done to you? Has he bewitched you? Step aside and let us deal with these heathens." "His name is Nachokai," she replied, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "And the only heathen I see is a man who would lie and cheat and humiliate a woman for his own greed." Suddenly, from the rocks all around them, figures rose. Nachokai and his warriors. They seemed to materialize from the very stone rifles and bows leveled at the stunned posse. They were caught. Courtman's warning had been prophetic. They had ridden straight into a trap. The posse members shifted nervously in their saddles, their hands hovering over their guns. Beau's face turned from shock to a pasty white fear. "This is between you and me, Beau," Abigail continued, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "You didn't come here to rescue me. You came because your pride was wounded. You came because you learned about my aunt's inheritance." The men in the posse exchanged uneasy glances. They had been paid to rescue a damsel in distress, not to settle a rich man's financial dispute. "That's a lie," Bow sputtered, but his eyes betrayed him. "Is it?" Abigail challenged. "You declared me a deceiver of questionable means. Yet here you are with 20 armed men trying to rescue the fortune that is now legally mine. Tell me, Bow, who is the deceiver here?" From his position on the rocks, Nachokai watched his rifle steady. He saw the courage in Abigail, the way she faced down the man who had wronged her, using the truth as her weapon. A fierce pride swelled in his chest. She was not fighting like a white woman or an Apache woman. She was fighting like Abigail. Courtman the tracker had seen enough. This wasn't a heroic rescue. It was a fool's errand that was about to get them all killed. "This ain't our fight, Sinclair," he growled, slowly raising his hands. "We were paid to rescue a captive, not fight her battles." One by one, the other hired guns followed his lead, lowering their weapons and raising their hands. They were mercenaries, not martyrs. Bow was left alone, surrounded by his own paid men, who had abandoned him, facing a woman he could no longer recognize, and a group of warriors who held his life in their hands. His heroic fantasy had crumbled into a pathetic, dangerous reality. "You have no honor, Sinclair." Nachokai's voice boomed from the rocks, making Bow jump. "You are not worthy to speak her name. You will leave this place now, and you will never return. If you or any of your men are ever seen in these mountains again, you will not be warned." Desperate and cornered, Bow made one last foolish move. He drew his pistol not at the warriors on the rocks, but at Abigail. "She's coming with me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. Before he could even fully level the gun, an arrow hissed through the air. It did not strike him, but it pinned the sleeve of his coat to the pommel of his saddle with supernatural accuracy. He cried out in shock and dropped the pistol as if it were on fire. Nachokai lowered his bow. His message was clear. He could have killed him. He chose not to. The ultimate act of contempt. "Go," Nachokai commanded, "while you still can." Courtman didn't need to be told twice. He spurred his horse around and started back down the trail. The rest of the posse followed suit, eager to escape the trap. They left Bow sitting there, pinned to his own saddle, trembling and defeated. One of the last men to leave a grim-faced miner paused, pulled the arrow from the saddle and tossed it to the ground at Bow's feet. "You're on your own," he spat before riding off, humiliated, abandoned, and utterly broken. Bow finally spurred his horse and fled a lone coward, disappearing into the twilight. Silence descended on the valley once more. The warriors lowered their weapons. Abigail stood her body, trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. It was over. Nachokai came down from the rocks and walked to her side. He stood before her, his expression serious. He gently took the knife from her trembling hand. "You fought with the heart of a warrior, Abigail," he said, his voice low and filled with a respect that warmed her more than any fire. She looked up at him, at this man who had become her protector, her ally, her world. The barriers between them of race, of culture, of a past she had shed seemed to have dissolved in the heat of the confrontation. You said I was yours," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Was that a claim of possession, or was it a promise? He reached out and for the first time touched her face with a tenderness that made her breath catch. His thumb gently stroked her cheek. "It was a promise," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "A promise that you would never be cast away again, that you would have a home, that you would have a protector." He paused, his gaze searching hers. if that is what you still want. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but these were not tears of shame or fear. They were tears of relief, of belonging, of a profound and unexpected love. "It is," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Ha'i, it is what I want." He leaned in and kissed her then. It was not a rough, possessive kiss, but one of deep, shared understanding. It was a kiss that sealed a bond, forged in humiliation and defiance, a bridge between two worlds, built in the heart of the savage lands that had become her home. In the arms of the Apache warrior, Abigail Hayes was finally, truly saved. That is the story of Abigail and Nachokai, a testament to the fact that home is not always the place we are born, but the place where we are seen, respected, and loved for who we truly are. It's a story of courage in the face of prejudice, of finding strength in the deepest moments of despair, and of a love that defied every law of the so-called civilized world. Theirs was a life carved out of the harsh but beautiful landscape of the Arizona frontier, a legacy not of conquest or wealth, but of a bridge built between two peoples, a fragile peace won through honor and a shared heart. If you were moved by the journey of the woman who was rejected and the warrior who claimed her, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story of love and survival, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more epic tales from the untamed heart of the Wild West. Thank you for listening.